for the month Vat, to thank the Elbaum Mishpacha for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month in memory of their father, husband, Yaakov, couple, Ben Avram Menachem Jerry Elbaum Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah and the family in Nechama. And to thank Mrs. Bracha Strimber for being our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Shvat, dedicating all the shiurim and drashos in memory of her beloved husband, Avi Ben Kamen Eliezer Halevi. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah and the family in Nechama. We also thank our Week of Learning sponsors, the Getz family, in memory of Moshe Chaim's father and mother, Alter Binyamin, and Chana Chaya Bas Moshe Zichron Livracha. We hope that the Neshamas will have an Aliyah and the families in Nechama. But also with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Nun Tes 59. So we have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. Really beautiful, fascinating, beautiful Gemara. We are picking up on Nun Ches 58b, and we're picking up at the Tanur Rabbanon, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 lines up from the bottom. So we'll say yesterday, Baruch Hashem, we established our timeline. Right now we know again, we established our timeline on a regular day for Karban Tamid. We established our timeline on Erev Pesach that falls out on Erev Shabbos or on a weekday. And we established our timeline for what is probably the most hectic day in the Beis HaMikdash, which is when Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos itself. Now, we're going to expand the conversation a little bit. Before we expand, just to go ahead and get a little bit of understanding on one piece. Tana Abanam. I will say, one of the interesting sacrificial facts that we outlined yesterday, no carbon should be offered up before the Tamid Shal Shachar, the morning Tamid, and no carbon is offered up after the afternoon Tamid. So where do we know that from? So from where do you know that nothing can be offered up before the morning Tamid? Talmud Omar va'arach ha'ola, because the pasuk says you shall arrange on it the ola. Okay, Rose says that's the Tamid that's the Tamid Shal Shachar, the morning Tamid. So the Gemara says, okay, what's my Talmudah? So what are you talking about? Like, what's the limud? Amarava ha'ola ola rishona. That the ola ultimately again the Tamid Shal Shachar ha'ola the ola. It is the first item offered up in the morning. Uminayin shein davar karev achar Tamid Shal Ben Abayim. And how do you know that no carbon is offered up after the afternoon Tamid? Talmud Lomar v'hiktir aleh chal ve'ashlamim. So both say again. How does that pasuk show me anything? Literally, what it means is you shall offer up upon it the fats of the shlamim. My Talmudah, Amrabaye aleha shlamim, velo al chaberta shlamim. So we'll say Abaye understands that what it means is after it meaning the morning tamid. After you offer up the morning tamid, so then the Torah says chal ve'ashlamim. You could offer up additional karbanos, but it's only after the morning tamid that you could offer up additional karbanos. Not after the afternoon tamid. Amar Abaye aleha shlamim velo al chaberta shlamim. Maskif la Rava ema shlamim hu lo nakrib ha olos nakrib. So maybe it only means that after the tamid shall be in the afternoon tamid, you can't offer up olos, but you could. I'm sorry, you can't offer up shlamim, but you could offer up olos. Ela Amar Rava hashlamim or literally hashlamim aleha hashlam kala karbanos kulam. But rather, again, Rava says, Rava say just a little bit of a tweaking of the drasha. What the pasuk means is aleh hashlamim. There, it's a little bit of a play on words. Shlamim hishlim. Upon it shall you complete the sacrificial service of the day, which teaches me that after the morning tamid I could offer up additional karbanos, but after the afternoon tamid I am not permitted to offer up additional karbanos. Therefore, Rava say the Gemara is learning this out. So again, I learned two things. Number one, that the morning tamid is the first carbon of the day, and that effectively the tamid shall be in the afternoon tamid is the last carbon of the day. Now I will say, I want to be clear. We know already that that at night they would burn leftover fats and limbs, right, on the mizbeach. But that's not called offering up of karbanos. In terms of an active offering up of karbanos, the tamid shall be in the afternoon tamid was the last carbon of the day. So therefore, I will say, on a regular day, just so we know, on a regular day, the last carbon, right, final carbonic call was 8.5 hours into the day. It was shechted. 9.5 hours into the day, it was offered up, and that was the last sacrificial service of the day. Now Rabbi say, watch this. Something very interesting happens. So we've spent all of this time saying Tamid Shal Shachar is the first carbon, Tamid Shal Ben Abayim is the last carbon, and now we're about to change this. This is great. Tan Rabbanan, Tamid Kodem LePesach. So we'll say, watch this. Now what does the Brisa say? The Tamid Shal Ben Abayim, the afternoon Tamid, was offered up before the carbon Pesach. It was offered before the carbon Pesach. Pesach Kodem Lektores, Kitores Kodemes Leneros. Okay, so we'll say, so listen to this. So now in the order, now we're jumping back to Erev Pesach. So what happens at Erev Pesach in the Beis HaMikdash? So apparently the order is like this. Tamid Shal Ben Arbayim, afternoon Tamid, Carbon Pesach, Kitores, incense, and ultimately again Neros, kindling of the menorah. That was the order of temple service. Top of Nun Tes. Now we'll say, now where do we get that order from? So it's very interesting. Yu'uchar davar shene'emar bo ba'erev ubein ha'arbayim, ledavar shelo ne'emar bo ba'erev ela bein ha'arbayim. Because you're supposed to listen to this. By Pesach, like current Pesach, the Torah uses two lashonos of what we'll call evening. It says erev and bein ha'arbayim. So Pesach has two words or two phrases that highlight an afternoon, evening, versus carbon tamid that only says bein ha'arbayim, only says in the afternoon once. Bilvad. So I will say. So therefore, again, interestingly enough, what the Gemara is going to say is, since Pesach has two mentions, ba'erev and bein ha'arbayim, and Tamid only has one mention, bein ha'arbayim, therefore Pesach is offered up later than the carbon Tamid. Okay? So the Gemara says, Ihachi, if that's the case. So we'll say, so by the way, I just want to point out, obviously, from the Mishnah, we already saw that carbon Pesach is offered up after the carbon Tamid, right? That was already obvious from the timeline. It's just interesting that carbon Pesach is going to be the exception. Whereas for every single other type of carbonic service, Tamid Shal Ben Abayim, the afternoon Tamid, is the last carbon offered. Carbon Pesach will be the exception. So the Gemara says, Ihachi, if that's the case, Ketores Veneros Nami Niktimula Pesach. If that's the case, Rabosai, that the timeline of temple service is determined by these words like Ba'erev and Bein Ha'arbayim, and the more of these Erev Bein Ha'arbayim words you have, the later you are performed in the day, then in reality, Pesach is the only item that has two of these words, Ba'erev and Bein Ha'arbayim. If that's the case, then let's go ahead and the Gemara says, then you should offer up the Ketores and light the menorah before you go ahead and offer up the Karban Pesach as well. Because after all, again, as we're going to see by the menorah, all I see is the word Bein Arbayim. So if Pesach has both Ba'erev and Bein Ha'arbayim, maybe it should be mamish the last thing you do. So it should be Tamid, Ketores. We know Ketores comes before menorah, as we'll discuss. Tamid, Ketores, menorah, and then Pesach. Why are you putting Pesach before Ketores and menorah? To which the Gemara says, Shiny Hasam Demiyet Rachmana Oso. It's different. Like Ketores and menorah are going to be different because the Torah ultimately again says Oso. Now the Oso that the Gemara is referring to is Ba'olam Moed Michutz Lafarochas Sha'ala Idus Yaroch Oso Aaron. When speaking about the menorah, the Torah says Aaron will arrange it. Oh, it. So we'll say, so what does that mean? So the Torah says that the menorah is something specific and unique. This sanya. We'll say, so what's the limud? What's the limud? This sanya. Me erev va'ad boker. So remember, the Torah says that the menorah has to burn from the morning to the evening. From the morning to the evening. We'll say Nun Tes Samad Aleph, 8 lines down from the top. Me erev va'ad boker tein la midasa. So we'll say, what does it mean from the morning until the evening? You have to give enough oil in the menorah. Tein la midasa. Shetei dolekes me erev ad boker. Make sure to put enough oil in the menorah. Ultimately, again, to allow it to remain lit from the evening until the morning. Davar acher, the other possibility that it teaches us is, Ein lecha avoda shekshera me erev ad boker ela zu bilvad. There is no other avoda which is performed in the Beis Hamikdash me erev ad boker, from the evening until the morning. So remember again, as far as sacrificial or really temple service is considered, is concerned, the Beis Hamikdash shuts down at sunset, or we'll call it at evening. So there's only one avodah that erev ad boker, and that's ultimately again the kindling of the menorah. So my time, what's the reason for this? Amar Kra Ya'aroch oso Aaron ubanav me'erev ad boker. The pasuk says that Aaron and his sons will arrange it being a reference to the menorah, from the evening until the morning. Oso me'erev ad boker ve'im davar achar me'erev ad boker. It is only the menorah which is arranged from evening until morning and nothing else. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? You see from here that in the order of daily temple service, the menorah is the last thing that is done. It's the latest avoda. So therefore, again, it can't. So remember what the Gemara was positing, just to follow the flow. So the Gemara said, how do you know which comes first, Tamid or Pesach? So what did the Gemara answer? So Pesach goes later. Why? Because by Pesach it says Ba'erev and Bein Ha'arbayim, and by Tamid it just says Bein Ha'arbayim. Okay, so if that's the case, then Pesach should go after menorah and Ketoras, or Ketoras and menorah as well. Since Pesach says Ba'erev Bein Ha'arbayim, and ultimately again by menorah it only says Bein Ha'arbayim. But to which the Gemara says no. Menorah is different because of this pasuk Yaroch Oso Aaron Abanav Me'erev Ad Boker. That menorah is the only avoda which ultimately again takes place from evening until morning. Oso, only menorah and nothing else. So because of that, by definition, menorah is the last avoda performed in the Beis Hamikdash. So what about ketoras? Where do I get incense from? So watch this. The iskish ketoras laneros. And ultimately, again, the ketoras is compared to the menorah. We'll say like Rashi, almost right across from Rashi. The iskish ketoras laneros. Maneros in avoda kshera achareha. Just as neros, there is no avoda which is permitted after it. Af kitoras ein avoda kshera achareha. So we'll say we'll discuss this hekish in a bit, in a little bit, exactly where we learn this from. But the point over here is that the Gemara is telling us is that kitoras is always attached to menorah. Kitoras is always attached to menorah. The Gemara is suggesting, kind of working backwards. We know that menorah has to be last. We know that ketoras is always next to menorah. So working backwards from the end, we're going to have menorah, ketoras, karban Pesach, and then Tamid. Because Pesach is going to be later than Tamid, because by Tamid it just says Bein Ha'arbayim, and by Pesach it says Ba'erev and Bein Ha'arbayim. So because of ultimately, again, both of these, therefore halacha l'maisa, that's the Tanya ki kusha. And also we have a brisa that asks this same question. Tamid kodem lektoras, kitoras kodemes leneros, the neros kodmos lepesach. So why don't I say that the tamid comes before kitoras, kitoras comes before neros, ultimately should come before Pesach, which I will say is just another way of asking the same question. Why don't we say that Pesach really should be the last thing you do in the day, right? Pesach should be done after menorah. Now, why would you think that Pesach should be done after menorah? I'll tell you a very simple reason. Ye'uchar davar shene'emar bo ba'erev ubein ha'arbayim ledavar shelo ela bein ha'arbayim bilvad. Both say it's very simple because Pesach, current Pesach, has two mentions of afternoon, evening, and it says bein ha'arbayim, which I both said the double mention would seem to indicate to us that Pesach should be the latest or last form of service performed. So why don't I make it Tamid, Ketoras, Torah, and then Pesach afterwards? I've Haksiv Oso. But one second, by menorah, it says Oso, right? The pasuk was we quoted before. Yaroch Oso Aaron Ubanov Mi Erev Ad Boker, which sounds like menorah is the only thing that is done ultimately in the evening. It says, Hi Osomi Boile. No, I need the Oso by menorah to teach me something different. Says the Gemara, Lemeute Avoda Shebifnim. To teach me ultimately that what? That the avoda performed in the inside of the Beis Hamikdash, umaynihu, what is that referring to? Ketoras. So I will say ultimately Oso teaches me that menorah is the last service that is performed, but not, or I should say the later service that is performed. It's performed later than Ketoras. So the Gemara says, why? What would I have thought? So the Gemara, so my nihu Ketoras, because I would have thought as follows: Holuksiv ubahalos Aaron esaneros bein ha'arbayim yaktireno. I might have thought that since the pasuk says that when Aaron will go ahead and kindle the neros bein ha'arbayim in the afternoon or evening, yaktireno, he will kindle it. Ima Nadlik Neros Beresha, V'Hadar Naktir Ketores. I might have thought that first the Kohen Gadol should light the menorah, and then afterwards he should go ahead and kindle the Ketores. So remember again, Ketores, the incense, done on the small golden altar, the small golden Mizbeach, inside of the Beis HaMikdash proper, inside of what we call the Kodesh. So the Gemara says, Ella, Beina Arbaim Yaktirena Lamali. So rather, why do I need that phrase, Beina Arbaim Yaktirena? Halchi Kamar, this is what it means to say, Achram Rachmana. Bi'idan Dimadlakas Neros Tekachra Ketores. Rather, Rabbi say what the Torah is teaching me is as follows: that halach lamaisa at the time that the menorah is kindled, at the time that the Kohen is about to light the menorah, the ketores must already be burning. So I will say, so therefore, mamish, the order of the day is that the Kohen offers up the ketores, goes from the ketores to go ahead and kindle the menorah. So I will say, where the Gemara is holding right now is really something quite fascinating. So the Gemara is suggesting over here as follows. So we'll see exactly halacha lamaisa how the day actually pans out. But we have two kind of versions over here. We're not exactly sure where Karban Pesach fits in terms of the ketores and menorah, right? Because one, you had Tamid, Pesach, ketores, menorah. In the brisa that we just quoted, it said Tamid kodem ketores kodemes leneros, neros komos lepesach. So we'll say in this version, remember again, where did it have Karban Pesach? It had Karban Pesach ultimately where? After the menorah. So again, we'll discuss. So two different, what we know, just in general, without the Karban Pesach, what we know on a regular day is that it's going to be Tamid, Ketores, Neros. That I do know. So the shaila is where Karban Pesach fits in this. Is Karban Pesach going to be before Ketores? Because remember again, Ketores and Neros will always be a package. So ultimately, is it going to be before Ketores or is it going to be after Neros? So Tana Rabbanan, let's analyze a bit more. Tana Rabbanan, I'll say another interesting qualification of this. Right, the other interesting qualification here, let me just see if I can pull up the Rambam quickly. I will pull up the Rambam, if not, okay, you know what, okay, we'll say it for later. So I will say now we're modifying a bit more as well. We said before that halacha l'maisa, the tamid shel shachar, the morning tamid, is the first carbon which is offered, and nothing is offered up before it, with one exception. There is no, we'll say pretty much right in the middle of Nun Tasamad Aleph, there is no sacrifice up before the morning tamid. Ella ketores bilbad, with the exception of ketores. Shene'emar ba baboker. Because the Torah says by ketores, by the morning ketores, baboker, two bokers. Yuktam ketores davar shene'emar ba baboker, dechse vehiktira alav aron ketorsim baboker. Ledavar shelo ne'emar ba ella boker echad. Beautiful. So I'll say, so what you begin to see is the Torah, it's fascinating. The way the Torah frames, or I should say articulates, the different karbanos also gives us a timeline. So Tamid Shel Shachar, the morning Tamid, it says Boker once. The morning Ketores, it says Boker twice. The double Boker indicates to us that it is offered up earlier in the timeline. So therefore, again, whereas normally the morning Tamid is indeed the first item mentioned, or the first carbon offered, halacha l'maisa, the ketores is offered up even earlier than the tamid. Incredible. And there is nothing that is brought after the afternoon tamid. Ele ketores, veneros, upesach, umuchusar. Before we go on, except for what? Ketores, incense, neros, menorah, and pesach. Now, what I want to point out over here is once again, you see this brisa supporting which order? Pesach after menorah, right? So again, Pesach after menorah. So therefore, we'll say in this version, it's going to be Tamid, Ketores, menorah, and then Karban Pesach. So again, we'll see halacha l'maisa, but now watch this. The brisa now throws in a little bit of another curveball in this. Umechusar Kippurim be'erev Pesach, and I will say someone who is mechusar Kippurim. Now, remember again, let's talk about that for just a moment. Look at Rashi. It's almost right across Rashi. If you just move rightward and go about 8 lines up, you'll see Mechusar Kippurim Kigon Mitzora Ozav Sheshachach V'lo Hevi Kaparaso Kodem L'Tomid V'im Lo Yivi Enu Lo Yochal Pesach the Mechusar Kippurim Asher B'Kadshim V'Anosh Kras. Let's listen to this. So following situation. Let's say you have a Mitzora or a Zav. Now, I will say, if a person's a Mitzora or a Zav, so the halacha is that such an individual, a number of different components to their purification. So first of all, again, they have to go ahead and count a certain number. They have to go to the mikvah and they have to bring karbanos. And I will say each form of purification allows them to do something additional. What the bringing of their karbanos allows them to do is partake in kachim, is partake in karbanos. So we'll say, so let's say the following situation. Let's say you have who went through his entire purification process, but he did not yet bring his karbanos. So we'll say if he doesn't bring his karbanos and it's Pesach, he can't eat karban Pesach. So imagine the following scene. It's Erev Pesach, happened over here. It's Erev Pesach, and halacha l'maisa, the Mitzora forgot to bring his karbanos. So now it's Erev Pesach going into Pesach. So you've offered up your tamid, you've done the ketoras, you go and you lit the menorah, you offered up karban Pesach. And now the Mitzora realized, oh, I didn't bring my karbanos. So the Brisa says, allow him to bring his karbanos under those circumstances. Umechusar kippurim be'erev Pesach, shetovo shenis va'ocheles pischol erev. We would allow him to bring his, even though Abba say normally what? What did we just say before? Under normal circumstances, what closes out the sacrificial day? Right? Menorah, from a service perspective, but which carbon closes out the day? Tamid shel bein arbaim. Right? If it's Pesach, then Pesach. But the Gemara says now there's one exception. Mechusar Kippur, which Abba say, but if the exception is logical, why is the exception logical? Because if we don't allow the Mitzorah to go ahead and bring his carbon, what's going to happen? He can't eat karban Pesach. So as to allow him to eat karban Pesach, we allow him to bring his karbanos that night as well. That evening. It's not night yet. That evening. And therefore he goes to the mikvah, and he goes there and he's able to eat his karban Pesach that evening. So it's a very dramatic idea. So this entire time we've been saying that the close of sacrificial service is the tamid shel bein arbaim, the afternoon tamid. Maybe there's an exception by karban Pesach. Now the Gemara says one more exception. Mechusar Kippurim, person who was tamei, now became tahar, is missing everything except his karbanos. If you don't let him bring his karbanos now, he's not going to be able to eat his karban Pesach, so we let him bring. Rabbi Yishmael ben Yochanan ben Baroka Omer, Af Mechusar Kippurim b'shayimos hashana, shetovel va'ochel b'kadshim la'arav. So we'll say, now this is pretty wild. So Rabbi Yishmael says, by the way, it's not just Pesach. We would allow this any day. So if a Mitzorah shows up in the Beis HaMikdash and he says, Oy vavai, I thought I was going to get here before 8.5 hours into the day, not every Pesach. I know I learned the Mishnah in the 5th parak of Pesachim. I know you slaughtered the Tamid at the 8th hour, 8.5 hour, you offered up at 9.5. I got stuck in traffic, but I want to eat karbanos, I want to eat sacrificial meat this evening, but I didn't offer up my karbanos. So Bishmael says we would allow him to offer up his karbanos that evening or that afternoon after the Tamid as well, in order to go ahead and allow him to partake of kachim. Pretty amazing. I'll say, look at Rashi for just a moment. So Rashi says, B'shari Yemos Hashana, Im Hevi Shalmi Nedava Kodem HaTamid, V'hu Las Kachim Asehu, Bein Hanei Achalim L'Kahanim, Bein Hanei Achalim L'Yisrael. So we'll say, we're going to see the logic of this is that the consuming sacrificial meat in a state of tara is an aseh, or I should say the consumption of sacrificial meat is an aseh, is a positive commandment. And the obligation to go out and close out the sacrificial day with the karban tamid is also an aseh. So what Rabbi Shmuel is going to say is the aseh of consuming sacrificial meat is docha the aseh of the tamid. And then Rabbi Shmuel says on any day, if someone shows up and didn't yet offer up his what we'll call atonement, of your purification karbanos, we would let him do so even after the tamid was offered. Pretty amazing. So let's analyze this. So Bishlam la Tanakama. So I understand. Now remember, the Tanakama says you could do this on Erev Pesach, but that's the exception. So this makes sense. Why? So Yavo Asay de Pesach sheyesh bo kares, v'yitcha Asay de Hashlama shein bo kares. Because they both say, let the Asay of Pesach, right? The bless you, the positive commandment to consume Korban Pesach, let that set aside the Asay of Hashlama. The Rabbi say, what's the Asay of Hashlama? Rashi points out over here, Allah Hashlim. The Asay of Hashlama, Rabbi says that after the morning Tamid is when you offer up Karbanos, but you do not offer up Karbanos after the afternoon Tamid. So I understand on Pesach, we will say, let the Asay of Pesach be docha, set aside the Asay of what we call Hashlama. For our purposes, the Asay of Hashlama says the sacrificial day ends with the Tamid Shal Bein Ha'arbayim. El Rabbi Shlomo Rabbi Yochanan Baroka, my ume de hayasay, me hayasay. But ultimately, again, according to Rabbi Shlomo Baroka, so we'll say, by the way, what's the logic? Because if you don't eat Korban Pesach is associated with kares, right? There's a function of kares. So I understand why the Asay of Pesach should be docha the Asay of Hashlama. But according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, my ume de hayasay me hayasay. We'll say on any given day when the mitzvah is up in the Beis Hamikdash, and he missed, right? They already offered up the Tamid Shal Bein Ha'arbayim, but yet he has to offer up his purification carbon. So there are two Asays. Asay number one is the Asay of Hashlama, which tells you sacrificial service ends with the Tamid Shal Bein Ha'arbayim. And there's another Asay. The other Asay is for a person to eat their sacrificial meat in a state of Tara. So why should the Mitzora's Asay of carbonic consumption be docha the Asay of Hashlama? In other words, they're both equal Asays. See, the Pesach and the Asay of Hashlama are not equal because the Asay of Pesach carries with it potentially a penalty of kares. So I understand why the Asay of Pesach is docha the Asay of Hashlama. But why would the Asay of a regular, we'll call it carbonic consumption, why would that be docha Hashlama? Why would it set aside Hashlama? We're talking about Rabbi Rabosai, where the particular individual in question, Rabbi Shmuel's case of Mechusar Kippurim, was talking about, let's say if you have a poor Mitzorah, he offers up ultimately again his chatas from a bird. Now when you offer up your chatas from a bird, the only thing that happens is a blood application, right? The bird itself is not offered up on the Mizbeach. So look at Rashi, Hacha right across in Rashi, Hacha, the Kamar Rabbi Shmuel, Af Mechusar Kippurim and Mitzorah Ani Kamar, Shemevi chatas ofen echalas lakana ve'maktara, so both say this is great. So Rav says, what are we talking about? We're talking about a very specific case of a pauper Mitzorah who shows up, he forgot, he didn't get a chance to offer up his chatos. What is chatos? It's a bird. And what do you offer up when you offer up a bird? All there is a blood application. There's no actual of an animal on the Mizbeach. Oh, that's when Rabbi Yishmael says, okay, let him offer it. Why, Rabbi? Because the Asay of Hashlama means you can't offer up any other animal on the Mizbeach, bless you, after the Tamid Shal Bein Ha'arbayim has been offered. But a blood application, that's no big deal. That's when you could do it. So the Gemara says, Papa Amar, Afilu Tema Bechatas Behema. Papa says, no, Rabbi Shmuel could be referring even to a Chatas Behema, even to allow the Mitzorah to mamish offer up an actual animal. How do you do that? So the Gemara said, this is fascinating. Rather, what do you do? Ma'ala umalina barosh shel mizbeach. So we'll say, what do you do? What does it mean when you offer up the carbon? All you need to do is shecht it, do the blood applications, bring the sacrificial meat up, and lay it on the ramp of the altar of the mizbeach, and leave it there until tomorrow. Leave it there until tomorrow. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Ma'ala umalina barosh mizbeach. Rashi says, all you need to do is shecht it, bring it up to the Mizbeach, and ultimately go ahead and offer it the next day. La'achar tamid shel shachar. I'll say, but 1 second, to leave a carbon unoffered over the course of the night, doesn't that become nosar? Doesn't that become possible some other way? So the Gemara says, "Valina eina posels b'rosham mizbeach." Both say this is just a fascinating fact. Apparently, once sacrificial meat is put on the Mizbeach, even if it's not offered, it does not become disqualified by staying there overnight. So we'll say, what a brilliant suggestion. So that Papa says, it's easy. So remember again, our Mitzorah shows up in the base. They already offered up the Tamid Shal Bein Harabayim. So we're a little bit stuck. According to we show, we're a little bit stuck. What are we stuck with? On one hand, there's an Aseh of Hashlama. Right? The Aseh of Hashlama says, once the Tamid Shal Bein Harabayim has been offered, that's it. Business, right? Done for the day, right? Done for the day. Can't offer up anything else. On the other hand, the Mitzorah has sacrificial meat that he wants to eat that night. And in order to do that, he has to offer up his karbanos. So Rav Papa suggests this brilliant suggestion. Shech the carbon, bring the sacrificial meat up on the Mizbeach, but don't burn it. So watch this. Because you're not burning it, therefore what? Technically speaking, you're not offering up anything after what? The Tamid Shal Bein Harabayim. So you're not offering up, but because it's laying on the Mizbeach, it's ki'ilu, it's been offered. So that will allow the Mitzorah to go home that night and what? Partake of sacrificial meat. But halacha l'maisa, it will not be in violation of the asay of Hashlama. So the Gemara says, good. The ha'ika asham. But what about the asham? What do you do about the asham? Rashi says the lo asi, the opinion that's but isn't this incredible? This is absolutely incredible. Say these are little facts that are just so dramatically riveting. So Bose, now jumping back to the bird suggestion. So the bird only works ultimately by chatas. But what do you do about the asham? The Mitzorah has to bring in asham as well. Vayika asham. Bishom Rav Papa. So Bose, no problem. Rav Papa came up with this brilliant suggestion. Slaughter the carbon of the Mitzorah, bring it up on the Mizbeach. Magnificent. Bring it up on the Mizbeach. It accomplishes what it needs to for the Mitzorah. And that now, it's ki'ilu, he has gone ahead and offered up his carbon, but we actually don't burn it until the next morning. But that's okay. There's no psul of leaving it overnight, because once essentially touches the Mizbeach, you're good to go. So the Gemara says, what would he say? Amri, so the Gemara says, Amri, shekara v'ashamo. It must be that the case of the Mitzorah is where he already offered up his asham, and the only remaining item is to offer up his chatos. But remember again, the Mitzorah has to bring a whole host of karbanos. What about the ola? Maybe you'll say that in general, law of the Mitzorah is not ma'akib. Even if he didn't offer up his ola, he could still eat other sacrificial meat. So Gemara says, "V'atanya we learned Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Roka Omer, kashem shechatasa v'ashom ma'akvin also kachol by Mitzorah. The same way that by Mitzorah his chatos and his asham prevent him from eating sacrificial meat, so too again his ola prevents him as well. So maybe you'll say no, he already offered up his ola. So he offered up his ola, he offered up his asham. The only thing that's still waiting is his chatos. So the Gemara says mi karva ola, so called him lechatos rishon. Can a Mitzorah offer Allah before his chatos? Vatanya, we learned v'hekrev eis asher lechatos rishona. Mat the pasuk says he will offer up his chatos rishona. Mat Talmud lomar. What is this teaching us? Im melame shetei kodemes liola. If you want to say that the chatos has to be offered up before the ola, havari kvar nemar v'asashini yasa ola k'mishpat. Torah already says explicitly, and the second carbon that the Mitzorah will offer will be an ola. Elazeh bana av l'kol chatos shekodmos l'chol olos habaysim. Another both say it's a binyan av. Binyan av means a principle. And what's the principle? Any time that you are bringing a chatos together with an olah, chatos always l'chol chatos shekodmos l'chol olos habaysim. Chatos always is offered up before an olah. The kaimalon dafilu chatos ha'ov kodemes li olas behema. And we learn that even a bird chatos, which Rabbi say is an inferior chatos, only utilized halacha l'maisa when the individual is poor, chatas ha'ov comes before olas behema. Comes before olas behema. Says the Gemara, Amarabba, shiny olas mitzorah. The olah of the mitzorah is different. Why? The Rachmana Amar Amid Beis. The Rachmana Amar vehela hakoin es ha'olah. That the kohen offered up the olah, which indicates to us what? Shehela kvar. That whereas normally we will say that the chatas must always precede the olah, apparently mitzorah is the exception, that the olah could come even before the chatas. Good. Amrali Rav Shman bar Amal Rav Papa. So we'll say, so again, just pointing out over here, remember how we got into this, because it's just incredible. Remember how we got into this. So remember again, we got into this by trying to determine the order of the day. So far the Gemara's holding is the order of the day is Tamid, Ketores, Neros, Menorah, Pesach. There's one exception. What's the exception to the rule? Mechusar Kippurim on Erev Yom Kippurim. The Mitzvah shows up, says, Oy vavoy, I missed the window. I didn't offer up my chatos or whatever. I didn't offer up a call. I didn't offer up my chatos. We let him offer up his chatos on Erev Pesach, even after the close of sacrificial business. Why? That makes sense. Because halacha l'maisa, the asay of Pesach is doche the asay of Hashlama. Rabbi Shmuel came along and said, by the way, it's not just Erev Pesach, but it's when? Every other day as well. If a Mitzorah shows up or a Zav shows up after the close of sacrificial business, and he says, I didn't offer up my karbanos and I want to eat kachim tonight, we would let him do it. Now I will say, how do we let him do it? According to Rabbi Shmuel, it appears the way we let him do it is we would shech the karban, we would bring up the sacrificial meat onto the mizbeach, but we would not go ahead and burn it. We won't burn it until the next morning. And apparently that makes everyone happy. This way, technically speaking, you're not offering anything after the tamid because you're not burning the sacrificial meat. But by placing it on the mizbeach, you allow the mitzorah to count it as if, not as if, but from the mitzorah's perspective, he has offered up his karban. So he could go home and eat his sacrificial meat, but at the same time, we're not burning anything until the next morning. Incredible. We'll say Nuntes Amud Beis, second line. Amar le Rav Shman bar Abba Rav Papa. Lididach. So Rav Shman bar Abba said to Rav Papa, according to you, the Amrit Ma'alo Umalina Barosha Shamizbeach. According to you, who said that when the Mitzorah shows up, we go ahead and we bring the sacrificial item up on the Mizbeach. And ultimately, again, we leave it there until the morning. So I'll bring the Mitzorah's chatos. We'll slaughter it. We'll put it on the Mizbeach, leave it there until morning. So the Gemara says, Shamizbeach, Ma'alo Umalina Barosha Shamizbeach. Kaimin va'avdinon moslo kandol asibelidei takala. So we'll say, how are you not? So the Gemara says, how are you not setting up a stumbling block for the Kohanim? Because what's supposed to remember again? What happens at night in the Beis Hamikdash? See, Kohanim think it's a 9-to-5 job. It's not a 9-to-5 job. But say, remember again, what are the Kohanim doing at night? They're burning the fats and limbs, which means pretty much like whatever is sacrificially left over is going on the fire. So you're putting now sacrificial meat on the Mizbeach. What's going to end up happening? The Kohanim are going to see it, right? They're going to see it, and they're going to go and end up burning it. You're going to end up burning it together with rosa, and they're going to end up burning it, by the way. See, it's problematic. Why is it problematic? Because they're going to end up burning it at night with the fats and limbs and not offering it up as a karban. To which the Gemara said, the Savri di Yomehu va'asilakture. They're going to assume that that is leftover karbanos from the day, and they're going to burn it. Amar le Kohanim's reason, hey. Don't worry about the Kohanim. The Kohanim are Zoris. They are alacritus. That's a word. Right? It's reason Rashi says, V'amalon sham yodia le'echav ha'kohanim v'yizruvein. So what's going to happen? The Kohen who brings up this karban to the Mizbeach, he's going to tell his brethren, he's going to tell them, by the guys, don't burn this. Don't burn this, right? This is a karban. We're leaving this here till tomorrow. Burn all the other stuff. Amalei Rav Ashi Rav Kana. Rav Huna Bari Rav Nasan Rav Papa. I v'hakama delo miskatri emurin kohanim lo matzi achli baser. But one second, I was saying, this is very nice that while when you place the karban on the mizbeach, so from the Mitzorah's perspective, it is now as if he has offered up his karban, and he is now permitted to go home and consume sacrificial meat. But one second, Kohanim are not permitted to eat sacrificial until when? Until the sacrificial parts are burned on the mizbeach. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Kol kamadolo mikturi emurin dechatos. As long as the limbs of the chatos have not been burned on the mizbeach, Kohanim basar achatos lo matzi achli ubailim lo havi luhu kapara v'adayin mechusar kipur. Oh, it was like we were so close. It was so exciting. You felt, right? It was palpable excitement to read Rabbi Shmuel's Shita because you thought, now wow, we have it all figured out. The mechusar kippurim will come. Offer up the karban. Don't burn it on the mizbeach. Just place the meat on the mizbeach. Fantastic. You haven't, technically speaking, offered up a karban after the Tamid Shal Ben Arbayim, but the Mitzorah gets his kapar. He can eat a sacrificial meat. Tushim Gemara says, no, the Mechusar Kippurim has not achieved his kapara. Because Rabbi say, when does the owner of a karban achieve kapara? Only when the Kohanim can eat the karban. And when could the Kohanim eat the karban? Only when? After it's been offered on the Mizbeach. So it turns out that while the meat is sitting there on the Mizbeach, the Kohanim can't eat. If the Kohanim can't eat, the owner doesn't achieve atonement. And if the owner didn't achieve atonement, then what? The Mechusar Kippurim hasn't accomplished, the Mitzvah hasn't accomplished anything. If it's Pesach, he can't eat Karban Pesach. And if it's just a regular night, he can't eat sacrificial meat. Incredible. This Sanya we learned. You might have thought that the Kohanim could eat their portion. Remember again, the Kohanim get the portion of the chazeh and the shok, which is the chest and the thigh. So you might have thought that the Kohanim could eat the chest and the thigh before the emurin are offered. Therefore, the pasuk says the kohen shall offer up the fat in the mizbeach. We'll say the order here is very specific. The Torah says that the kohen will offer up the chaylev on the mizbeach, the sacrificial part, and then it says that the kohen gets the chest and the thigh. The kama de kodim lo achli basar, and as long as the kohanim have not yet consumed the meat, bailim lo miskapri, the owners have not achieved atonement. This sanya va'achlu osam asher kupar bahem, they will eat them those who achieve atonement through it. Melamed shekohanim ochlim ubailim miskaprim. It teaches us that kohanim ultimately again eat the sacrificial meat, and the bailim, ultimately the owners, achieve atonement. So what do you see from here? You see from here that really a karban is only effective when halacha lemaisa the kohanim have the opportunity to eat their part. But the only time the kohanim have the opportunity to eat their part is ultimately again when the chaylev, right, when the sacrificial pieces have been offered up. But if they haven't been offered up, then ultimately owners don't achieve atonement. So therefore, it turns out that the suggestion that we are putting forward doesn't really work. This is wild. This is great. Since there's really no other option, because you can't burn the karban, right? You can't actually offer up the karban at night or after Talmud Shavin Arbaim. Since this is the best you can do, they treated it halachically as if the karban was lost or became tameh. The sanya yochol yitnitmu emurin osha avdulo yokanim zakon b'chazeh v'shok. You might have thought that what in a case, or let's say in a regular case where the karban for some reason became tameh or the karban was lost, you might have thought that halacha l'maisa the kohanim would not be entitled to a portion, to the Kohanic portions. Talmud Lomar, la'aron ulabanav mikol makom. Therefore, the pasuk says that the chest and the thigh will belong to Aaron in all cases. Therefore, we'll say in the case of where for some reason the sacrificial meat was lost or became tameh, the sacrificial parts, the Kohanim become entitled to the sacrificial parts. So therefore, the Gemara is suggesting over here that essentially in this kind of situation where the only option is to leave the meat, to leave the sacrificial meat on the mizbeach, we treat the meat as if it's been lost. And if it's been lost, the Kohanim are in fact entitled to eat their portions, even that evening before the karban has actually been burned. And because the Kohanim are entitled to eat their portions, therefore what? The owners achieve atonement. And because the owners achieve atonement, the Metzora would be permitted to eat his own sacrificial meat that evening as well. Incredible. Rav Kahana Rami Ksiv. Rav Kahana contrasts the two psukim. On one hand it says, Lo yolin chalev chagi ad boker. The pasuk says, "You shall not leave over chagi." So again, we'll discuss exactly what the context of this is in just a moment. So you can't go ahead and leave over the chaylev until the morning, or again, we'll call it the karban pesach until the morning. The Gemara says, "Ad boker hu delo yolin ha kol halayla kula yolin." But you can leave it over the entire night. Rashi says over here, "Ha kol halayla yolin." Rashi says, "Ulamata lamata." So we'll say it indicates to us that halacha l'maisa, you could offer up. It sounds like you could offer up a karban the entire evening. But then it says you shall offer up upon it the chal v'ashlam, which indicates to us Allah hashlim kol karbanos kulam. Which again, goes back to what we learned before, that no, you have to finish up all karbanos by Talmud Shabin Arbaim. Who most of love, whom mefarik law. Kishin Osru. He refers to what is it's a case. It's a case ultimately going to both have karbanos that were left over, which ultimately again refers to sacrifices to karbanos which had their blood sprinkled already during the day, but didn't have the opportunity to have their sacrificial meat burned on the mizbeach. As long as the zrika was done by day, you could burn even the leftover sacrificial meat over the course of the evening as well. All right, so we'll have to stop over here. We'll pick up with this sugya as well as the halacha l'maisa and round out the day, the sacrificial day in Mirtz Hashem tomorrow.